The crack of the whip split the dusty air, a vicious punctuation mark in Alara's already brutal existence. Not aimed at her directly, not this time, but close enough to make her flinch, the sting of humiliation sharper than any physical blow. "Move it, you worthless nag!" Silas's voice, thick with contempt, echoed off the false fronts of Redemption Gulch. He was herding her towards Kane's general store, not with a rope, but with the implied threat of far worse. Her stomach gnawed, a familiar ache that had become her constant companion since David's death in the mine 6 months and a lifetime ago. Thomas was hungry. That single, undeniable fact had become the axis around which her shattered world revolved. He was waiting for her in the back alley, as always. Silas, Kane's hulking shadow, a man whose eyes held the glint of a predator toying with its weakened prey. The exchange was swift, brutal in its unspoken terms. A small sack of weevily flour, a few strips of jerky that smelled faintly of dust and despair, shoved into her hands. His words were a greasy caress of degradation, each syllable stripping away another layer of herself. "The usual price, widow. Don't forget who keeps you fed." He never called her Alara. She was widow, a nameless entity defined solely by her loss and her desperation. She fled the alley, the meager provisions clutched tight, as if they were fragments of a lost treasure. The shame was a physical weight, bending her spine, burning her cheeks. How had it come to this? Alara Jean Vance, once full of laughter and dreams, now reduced to bartering the only thing left that hadn't been taken by grief and poverty. Her cabin, a small leaning structure on the very edge of town, offered little comfort, but it was a sanctuary of sorts, the only place where she could breathe without the suffocating weight of the town's pity or scorn. Thomas was there, his 7-year-old face pale and too knowing for his age. His eyes lit up at the sight of the food, a flicker of hope in their depths that tore at her heart. "Mama, did you—" He didn't need to finish the question. He understood in a way no child should ever have to. "Hush, little one," she murmured, forcing a smile that felt brittle and fake. "Just some work I did." A lie, but one she told herself as much as him. The thin stew she managed to coax from the flour and jerky was eaten in near silence, punctuated only by Thomas's small, grateful sighs. Afterwards, curled together on the worn cot, Thomas asked in a whisper, "Why is that mean man always giving us food, Mama?" Alara held him tighter. He owes us, sweetie. Just until Mama can find some real work." More lies, layered upon the first, a fragile shield against the harsh reality. She looked at her son's innocent face and vowed, silently, fiercely, that this would not be his future. She would find a way out, somehow, even if she had to crawl through hell to do it. The arrival of Caleb was like a ripple in the stagnant pond of Redemption Gulch. He rode in quietly, a lone figure on a dusty roan, his face weathered and unreadable beneath the brim of his worn hat. He carried himself with a quiet competence that spoke of a life lived on his own terms, a stark contrast to the hunched shoulders and averted gazes of the townsfolk under Kane's thumb. He dismounted in front of the livery stable, his gaze sweeping over the town with a detached curiosity. He saw Kane emerge from his grand office, the imposing figure casting a long shadow across the street. The townsfolk seemed to shrink back, their movements becoming hesitant. Silas, a brute of a man with scarred knuckles and cruel eyes, stood a pace behind Kane, a silent enforcer. Sheriff Brody, round and sweating even in the cool morning air, offered Kane a fawning nod. Caleb, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his Colt Peacemaker, absorbed the scene, recognizing the familiar dynamics of a town held captive by a strong man. He asked the stable hand about stabling his horse, his voice low and even. Later that day, the humiliation came in the harsh glare of the midday sun. Alara, her water bucket heavy, was hurrying back to her cabin, trying to avoid the eyes of the town. Cowboy, lounging on the porch of the saloon, spotted her. His booming laughter cut through the quiet street. "Well now, if it ain't the widow. Fancy seeing you out in broad daylight." He reached into his pocket and tossed a single, tarnished coin into the dirt at her feet. "Looks like you dropped something from last night's services." The word hung in the air, thick with malice. The few people on the street froze, their faces turning away, unwilling to witness her shame. Alara's breath caught in her throat. The coin lay there, a stark symbol of her degradation. Her cheeks burned, and tears pricked at her eyes, but she refused to give Silas the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Caleb, who had been watering his horse at the trough near the well, watched the entire exchange. His expression remained impassive, but there was a tightening around his jaw, a flicker of something unreadable in his deep-set eyes. Silas sauntered into the saloon, his laughter echoing behind him. The street slowly came back to life, the townsfolk scattering like startled birds. Alara stood frozen, staring at the coin in the dust. She couldn't bring herself to pick it up, nor could she bring herself to leave it there, a permanent mark of her shame. Then she heard footsteps. Not Silas's heavy tread, but lighter, more deliberate. Caleb walked over. He didn't look at her. He bent down, picked up the coin, dusted it off with his thumb, and held it out to her. "You dropped this, ma'am." Alara flinched, expecting a sneer, another cruel jibe. She kept her gaze fixed on the dusty ground. His voice was quiet, devoid of mockery. "I was talking to Jed at the stables. He mentioned the Vances, about David Vance's wife." He paused. "Your name is Alara, isn't it?" The sound of her own name, spoken with simple respect, was like a physical blow. It shattered the wall she had built around her emotions. Her head snapped up. She looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. His eyes were steady, kandatne. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She swallowed hard, unable to speak, and managed a small, hesitant nod. That evening, Caleb arrived at her cabin with a rabbit slung over his shoulder and a small sack of vegetables. He found her patching a hole in the roof with scraps of wood. Thomas peered out from behind her skirt, his eyes wide with suspicion. Caleb didn't offer platitudes or false sympathy. He simply said, "Had more luck hunting than I needed. Figured this might help." He knelt down and offered Thomas a piece of dried apple. Then his gaze drifted to the broken fence surrounding her small patch of land. "Fence could use some work, and that roof won't hold the next rain." He looked at Alara, his expression matter-of-fact. "I'm handy with a hammer, if you'll let me." Suspicion warred with a desperate hope in Alara's heart. Why was he doing this? What did he want? She had learned that kindness in this town usually came with a heavy price, but there was something in Caleb's quiet demeanor, in the way he looked at Thomas, that felt different. Tentatively, she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. News of the cowboy's interaction with the widow reached Kane swiftly, carried on the whispers of the watchful townsfolk. Silas recounted the scene in the saloon, his voice laced with a possessive anger. "That drifter, Kane, he spoke to her by name like she was someone." Kane, polishing his boots in his opulent office, merely chuckled. "A stray dog sniffing around a discarded bone, Silas. Let him have his illusions. It amuses me." But beneath the surface of his amusement, a seed of irritation had been planted. Any deviation from the established order of his town was a potential threat to his control. "Keep an eye on him, Silas. See what he's about. Everyone in Redemption Gulch understands the rules. This newcomer will too, eventually." Caleb, true to his word, spent the next few days repairing Alara's fence and reinforcing the roof of her cabin. He worked in silence, his movements efficient and skilled. Alara watched him, a cautious curiosity growing within her. He spoke little, answering her hesitant questions with brief, direct replies. Thomas, initially wary, began to trail after him, fascinated by his tools and his quiet strength. One afternoon, as Caleb was hammering in a fence post, he noticed Alara's constant vigilance, the way her eyes darted around, always scanning for unseen threats. He stopped working and looked at her, his gaze direct. "Do you know how to use a gun, Alara?" She shook her head, a shadow crossing her face. "David. My husband, he had one. But I never—" Caleb nodded. He went inside the cabin and returned with a dusty, well-worn revolver. He checked the cylinder, his movements practiced and sure. "This is a Colt Peacemaker, a good gun, but it's only useful if you know how to use it. He showed her how to hold it, the weight of the cold steel heavy in her hand. He guided her stance, showed her how to aim. They walked to a secluded grove behind the cabin. The first shot was deafening, the recoil jarring her arm. She flinched, her eyes wide with fear. Caleb's voice was calm, reassuring. Fear is natural, Alara. It keeps you alert, but you can't let it control you. Try again. Focus on the target. Squeeze the trigger, don't yank it. He patiently guided her through several more shots, his presence a steady anchor against her fear. Slowly, hesitantly, Alara began to find a measure of control, a small spark of confidence igniting within her. Their fragile peace was soon shattered by a series of petty, cruel acts orchestrated by Silas, acting on Cain's subtle directives. The repaired fence was torn down overnight. The few coins Alara earned doing laundry for the town doctor suddenly dried up. The doctor, his face etched with regret, mumbled about his wife's sudden need for more of his attention. Thomas's small, carved wooden horse, a gift from Caleb, was deliberately crushed under Silas's boot in the middle of the street, the brute laughing at the boy's tearful distress. The antagonism escalated. Caleb won a significant pot in a poker game at the saloon, much of it taken directly from Silas. Later that night, as he walked back to the stable where he was temporarily lodging, he was ambushed in a dark alley by two of Cain's ranch hands. The fight was brutal and swift. Caleb, though outnumbered, fought with a grim determination, his past life lending him a hard-edged skill. He managed to fend off his attackers, leaving them groaning in the dirt, but he was left bruised and bleeding. The next morning, Caleb, his jaw still aching, went to Sheriff Brody's office. He recounted the ambush, naming Cain's men. Brody, slumped behind his desk, didn't even bother to look up. Boys probably had a bit too much whiskey, got carried away after the poker game. Happens all the time. He offered Caleb a greasy smile. My advice, friend? Some folks in this town are best left alone. You seem like a smart man. Be smart. The message was clear. The law in Redemption Gulch was Cain's law, and it offered no protection to those who crossed him. Back at Alara's cabin, as she gently cleaned his cuts, a quiet intimacy settled between them. Why are you doing this, Caleb? She asked softly. Why are you helping us? He avoided her gaze, his voice low. I made mistakes in my past. Hurt people. This feels like a way to make amends. He didn't elaborate, but Alara sensed a deep-seated guilt, a burden he carried silently. She, in turn, spoke of David, of their dreams for a better life, of the crushing despair she had felt after his death. In their shared vulnerability, a deeper connection formed, a fragile understanding that transcended words. The unspoken tension between them, a delicate dance of attraction and fear, grew stronger. The simmering conflict finally boiled over under the scorching midday sun. Cain, enraged by Caleb's continued presence and his growing influence over Alara, decided to make a public spectacle, a brutal reminder of his absolute control. Silas dragged Alara from her cabin, her face pale with terror, and forced her into the middle of the dusty street. The townsfolk, drawn by the commotion, watched from the boardwalks, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Cain stood on the porch of his general store, his charismatic smile chillingly at odds with the menace in his eyes. Folks of Redemption Gulch, he announced, his voice booming across the silent street. It seems some among us have forgotten their place. This woman, he spat the word like a curse, has shown disrespect. She needs to be reminded of her obligations. He held up a large sack of flour. This can be hers, a gift, if she performs a small service for one of my boys, right here, for all to see. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Alara's body trembled, her eyes wide with horror. The humiliation was absolute, designed to crush her spirit completely. She felt a scream building in her chest, but no sound would come. Just as she felt herself teetering on the edge of utter despair, Caleb stepped forward. The crowd parted for him, a silent acknowledgement of the tension that crackled in the air. He wasn't reaching for his gun. He walked with a calm, purposeful stride directly towards Kane. He reached into his pocket and tossed a small, heavy pouch of coins at Kane's feet. The clink of the silver echoed in the stunned silence. "That should cover any debt she owes you," Caleb said, his voice clear and strong, cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. Kane's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing in surprise and fury. Caleb turned his back on Kane, walked to Alara, and gently helped her to her feet. He looked into her eyes, his gaze filled with a fierce tenderness. "Alara Jean Vance," he said, his voice ringing with a quiet authority that commanded the attention of everyone present. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The question hung in the air, a defiant challenge to Kane's power, a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. The townsfolk gasped, their fear momentarily overshadowed by shock and a flicker of something akin to hope. Alara's eyes filled with tears, not of shame, but of overwhelming gratitude and a dawning sense of possibility. She looked at Caleb's steady gaze, at the strength and kindness in his weathered face, and managed a trembling nod. A collective murmur swept through the crowd. The gauntlet had been thrown. The war for Alara's dignity, and perhaps for the soul of Redemption Gulch itself, had just begun. Back in the small cabin, the air was thick with a mixture of relief and trepidation. Thomas, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, clung to Alara's skirt, his eyes wide. "Mama, are you really going to marry him?" Alara knelt down and hugged him tight. "Yes, sweetie. Caleb is a good man." She looked at Caleb, her heart swelling with a gratitude that words couldn't express. "What have you done?" she whispered, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. Caleb met her gaze, his own softening. What needed doing? But they both knew that his impulsive act of chivalry had painted a target squarely on their backs. Kane would not let this stand. His pride, his sense of ownership over the town and its inhabitants, had been publicly challenged. "We need to be ready," Caleb said, his voice low and serious. "He won't let this go." He instructed Alara to pack a few essentials, enough to travel light. He checked his revolver, the familiar weight comforting in his hand. The proposal had been born of a desperate need to protect Alara, but in that moment, looking into her grateful eyes, Caleb realized it was more than just a tactic. A feeling he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge for years, a flicker of hope for something more than a solitary existence, had begun to bloom within him. Kane, meanwhile, was seething. The public defiance, the humiliation of being outmaneuvered by a two-bit drifter, fueled a rage that burned hotter than the desert sun. He paced his office, Silas a silent, hulking presence in the corner. "He embarrassed me, Silas, in front of everyone. That nobody." "What do we do, Kane?" Silas growled, his fists clenching. "We make him pay," Kane hissed, his eyes glinting with malice. "We make them both pay. But we need to be smart about this. We can't just shoot him down in the street. That would make him a martyr in her eyes, in the eyes of those spineless townsfolk." He stopped pacing, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "No, we'll use the law. Sheriff Brody may be a fool, but he's our fool." Under the cloak of darkness, Silas and two of Kane's most loyal ranch hands drove a small herd of Kane's cattle onto the barren patch of land behind Alara's cabin. Using a heated cinch ring, they crudely branded one of the animals with a set of initials that vaguely resembled Caleb's. It was a clumsy forgery, but Kane knew it wouldn't matter. Brody wouldn't question it. The next morning, Silas swaggered into the sheriff's office. "Brody," he drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the floorboards. "Looks like we got ourselves a rustler. Saw him last night, sneaking around Vance's place, and this morning, wouldn't you know it, a few of Kane's best steers are missing, and one of them was seen heading towards that cowboy's and the widow's place." He produced the crudely branded cinch ring. "Found this nearby." Brody's face paled. He knew it was a setup, a blatant lie, but the fear of Kane outweighed any semblance of conscience. He swallowed hard and nodded. I'll look into it, Silas." Later that day, as Caleb was splitting wood behind Alara's cabin, Sheriff Brody and a small posse of Kane's men rode up, their faces grim. Brody, his gaze averted, cleared his throat. "Caleb, I'm afraid I have to arrest you. Charge of cattle rustling." Caleb stared at him, his expression unreadable. He knew. He knew Kane wouldn't let him get away with his defiance. He looked at Alara, her face a mask of fear, and at Thomas, who clung to her leg, his small body trembling. He could fight. He was certain he could take them, or at least enough of them to make them think twice. But the cost would be Alara and Thomas's safety. With a sigh, he unbuckled his gun belt and laid it on the ground. "It's a mistake, Sheriff. But I'll come peacefully. I can explain everything." He looked at Alara, his eyes conveying a silent promise. "Don't worry, I'll sort this out." Alara watched in horror as they led Caleb away, the false accusation hanging in the air like a death sentence. The brief flicker of hope she had felt after his proposal was extinguished, replaced by a crushing wave of despair. That evening, Kane himself came to her cabin. He no longer bothered with the pretense of civility. His eyes held a cold triumph. "Your brave cowboy is in jail, Alara. The trial is a mere formality. He'll hang in 2 days." He paused, letting the words sink in. "However, I am a merciful man." He offered her a twisted smile. "Renounce him publicly. Declare the engagement a foolish game. Come live with me under my roof as my woman, and I will see to it that your cowboy escapes across the border. You'll never see him again, but at least he'll be alive." He watched her, his gaze predatory. "Choose, Alara. His life or your foolish pride." He gave her until the next night to decide. Alara didn't weep. The constant barrage of cruelty had finally cauterized her tears. Kane's vile offer, the stark choice between her dignity and Caleb's life, ignited a cold, hard fury within her. She would not break. She would not be owned. She retrieved David's old revolver, the weight familiar in her hand. Caleb's lessons echoed in her mind. Fear is natural, but don't let it control you. Her hands were steady. She went into town, her face set with a grim determination. Her first stop was the stable. Jed, the owner, a quiet, decent man who had witnessed Kane's tyranny for years and had grown to respect Caleb's quiet strength, was mucking out stalls. Alara told him everything. Kane's frame-up, the rigged trial, the impending hanging. She didn't ask for help, she simply stated the truth. A flicker of understanding, of long-suppressed defiance, sparked in Jed's eyes. Next, she visited the town doctor, a man whose conscience had been gnawing at him since he'd turned away Alara's laundry business. She recounted Caleb's arrest and Kane's blatant manipulation of the law. Again, she didn't plead. She merely asked if he might be able to create a diversion at the saloon that evening. The doctor, his face etched with guilt, nodded slowly. Finally, she returned to her cabin and wrote a short, carefully worded message. She sent Thomas, his small face grave with understanding, to deliver it to Kane. The message simply stated, "I accept your offer." Kane, reading the note in his opulent office, let out a triumphant laugh. He had broken her, just as he always broke everyone. He sent word to Silas to keep a close watch on the jail, ensuring Caleb wouldn't try anything foolish while he went to claim his prize. As dusk settled over Redemption Gulch, Kane arrived at Alara's cabin, 2 of his burliest ranch hands flanking him. Alara stood in the doorway, her face shadowed. "I'm ready," she said, her voice flat. Kane smirked. "That's a good girl." He stepped into the darkness of the cabin. "Now let's talk about the terms." Before he could finish his sentence, a rifle barrel materialized from the shadows, the cold steel pressing against his chest. Alara's voice, though quiet, held a steely resolve. "The only terms I accept are yours, Kane. You're going to tell your men to drop their guns, and then you're going to the jail." At the same moment, at the jailhouse, Jed delivered Caleb's meager evening meal. As he handed over the tin plate, his fingers brushed against Caleb's, surreptitiously slipping a small, sharp knife into his hand. Across town, the doctor, with a theatrical yell and a well-aimed punch, ignited a full-blown brawl in the usually sedate saloon, drawing the attention of the few deputies Kane had on his payroll. Inside the darkened cabin, Kane's eyes widened in disbelief and fury. You dare? You underestimated me, Kane," Alara said, her grip on the rifle unwavering. And you underestimated the few decent people left in this town. Outside, the sounds of the doctor's orchestrated chaos reached Silas at the jailhouse. A sudden unease settled in his gut. He peered into Caleb's cell. It was empty. Back at the cabin, Kane's two men burst through the doorway. The small space erupted in violence. Alara, surprisingly agile, ducked and weaved, the rifle bucking in her hands. The first man went down with a groan. The second lunged at her. She dropped the rifle and grabbed a heavy iron skillet, swinging it with all her might, connecting with a sickening thud. He crumpled to the floor. Alara burst out of the cabin just as Caleb, gun in hand, emerged from the jailhouse. Silas stood waiting for him in the middle of the dusty street, his face contorted with rage. "You think you can cross me, cowboy?" he roared. Caleb's reply was a curt nod. The two men faced each other, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Their fight was brutal, a whirlwind of fists and gunshots. Alara saw Caleb stumble, Silas looming over him, a knife raised to strike. Without hesitation, she raised David's old revolver, aimed, and fired. The shot rang out, echoing in the sudden silence. Silas staggered, a look of disbelief on his face, and then collapsed in the dust. Kane emerged from the shadows near Alara's cabin, his clothes torn, his face a mask of fury. His men were down. It was just him and Caleb left standing. The townsfolk watched from behind their drawn curtains. "This isn't over," Kane snarled, his hand reaching for his own gun. Caleb was faster. His Colt barked twice. Kane clutched his leg, a cry of pain escaping his lips, and crumpled to the ground. Caleb stood over him, his gun still smoking. He didn't fire again. "It is over, Kane," he said, his voice low and steady. "Your reign is over." The dawn broke over Redemption Gulch, painting the dusty streets in hues of pink and gold. Sheriff Brody, his face pale and drawn, rode out of town without a word, leaving behind his tarnished badge on the dusty floor of his office. Kane, his leg bandaged and his power broken, sat in his own jail cell, awaiting the arrival of the federal marshal. The townsfolk emerged from their homes, their faces etched with a mixture of exhaustion and a newfound sense of liberation. They looked at Alara, not with pity or scorn, but with a quiet respect. They had seen her fight. They had heard her reclaim her name. Caleb and Alara stood on the porch of her small cabin. Thomas nestled between them, his small hand clutching both of theirs. The violence of the night before had left its mark, but there was a sense of peace in the morning air. Caleb turned to Alara, his eyes filled with a tenderness that mirrored her own. "The offer still stands, Alara Jean Vance. If you'll have me." A true radiant smile finally broke through Alara's weary features. "I'll have you, Caleb." Hand in hand, with Thomas skipping ahead, they walked to a small rise overlooking Redemption Gulch. The town was scarred, battered, but it was free. Alara no longer looked over her shoulder. She looked towards the horizon, a sense of hope blooming in her heart. She had traded her body for food out of desperation, but a cowboy had given her back her dignity, and with it, her name. Now, together, they would build a new life, a future forged in the fires of adversity, in a town finally ready for redemption.